4 days before I was to walk my only daughter down the aisle, my best friend suddenly grabbed my arm, dragged me straight into a pitch-dark fitting room, locked the door from the outside, then leaned in close to the crack of the door and said in a low voice, "I think you need to know about this. Stay right here. Don't say a single word. No matter what happens, you have to keep completely calm." I hadn't even had time to grasp what was going on. Less than a minute later, through a slab of wood barely 2 centimeters thick, I heard the man about to become my son-in-law calmly discussing his plan to kill my daughter to collect a $12 million life insurance payout. He wasn't the least bit tense, not a shred of hesitation. His voice was so cold, so indifferent. It was as if he were deciding what to have for dinner. And me. I stood there, frozen in the dark. My heart seemed to stop. The blood in my body ran ice cold. And in that instant, I realized a horrifying truth. For the past 2 years, my entire family had been living with a monster, wearing the face of a perfect gentleman. And from that moment on, I could not sit still. My name is Everett Calder. I'm 70 years old, and for 40 of those years I was a structural engineer here in Seattle. I built bridges, overpasses, spans across the water, the kind of steel that has to hold under wind and weight and the slow grind of time without ever announcing what it's doing. I know how to spot a hairline fracture in a beam from 50 feet away, long before it becomes a collapse. I also spent my whole life restoring old mechanical watches at my kitchen table, because a man who loves how things are built loves the small machines most of all. Remember the watches. They matter later. My wife, Rosemary, passed 6 years ago. And after that, my daughter Elise was the only thing I had left in this world. Elise was 32. She ran a small floral design studio up in Ballard, the kind of place that smells like eucalyptus and rain, and she was blindingly happy. She was engaged to a man named Julian Sterling. Julian was 35. He drove a European sports car, wore suits that cost more than my first car, and told everyone he was a private tech investor from an old money family back east. He had a smooth way of talking that always felt a hair too rehearsed to me, but Elise looked at him like he'd hung the moon. As a father, you try to smother your own cynicism when you see your child glowing like that. I wanted to believe he was a good man. I was paying for the entire wedding, an extravagant affair at a waterfront club, because I wanted to give her the whole world. So that Tuesday, 4 days out, I drove down to a bespoke tailor shop in downtown Seattle to get fitted for my suit. The shop belonged to Enzo Ferraro, a master tailor and a close friend I'd known for 25 years. When I pushed open the glass door, the little bell chimed, and Enzo looked up from a bolt of dark cloth, and the color drained right out of his face. He rushed over, flipped the sign to closed, and threw the deadbolt. Before I could ask what on earth was wrong, he grabbed me by both shoulders, his hands shaking, and steered me hard toward the back of the shop, into the deepest fitting room, the one with heavy velvet curtains and solid wood walls. He looked me dead in the eye and told me to stay in the dark, to not make a single sound no matter what I heard. Then he shut the door and locked it from the outside. I was furious and completely disoriented. I almost pounded on the wood, thinking my old friend had finally lost his mind. And then I heard the front bell chime again, 2 sets of footsteps on the hardwood, and I recognized the voices instantly. It was Julian and Corinne. Corinne was Julian's older sister and his supposed business partner, in town for a week to help with the wedding. They walked right past my fitting room and stopped in the lounge, separated from me by nothing but an inch of decorative paneling, and I stood in that pitch dark, holding my breath, waiting to find out what was so urgent that Enzo had locked me away like a criminal. I thought maybe Julian was in financial trouble, maybe some small scandal he wanted hidden. I'm a practical man. I was ready to solve a problem. I was not ready for what I heard. Julian spoke first, and his voice had none of the warm, respectful tone he always used with me and Elise. He let out a low, arrogant little laugh that turned my stomach. He told Corinne they didn't need to look at any fabric today. He said the old man was completely clueless, that he'd signed the medical power of attorney at the rehearsal dinner, thinking it was just a routine tax trust. I pressed my ear flat against the cold wood. We had discussed a family trust to protect Elise's inheritance, but a medical power of attorney was never part of any conversation. Why would Julian need control of Elise's medical decisions? And then Corinne answered, her voice cold and flat as a blade, and she said that was good, because the second the ink dried on that document, the $12 million life insurance policy went fully active. And then she said the words that stopped my heart. She said Elise would not survive the trek in the Andes, a tragic accident at high altitude, and Julian would walk away the grieving husband holding every card. Julian laughed again. He agreed. He said it was a beautiful plan. The air in my lungs turned to ash. My legs nearly buckled under me in the dark, and my mind snapped back to the honeymoon. Julian had insisted, gently but relentlessly, on booking a remote high-altitude trek in Peru, a romantic adventure to a lodge somewhere thin and cold and far from anything. And my Elise, who hated the cold and had never climbed anything steeper than a staircase, had agreed just to make him happy. He was planning to kill her up there, and he needed me to blindly sign away my legal rights first, so I couldn't intervene when she was carried into a foreign hospital. They stayed another 5 minutes, calmly discussing how fast they could liquidate my portfolio once they controlled her estate. Every word was a sledgehammer against the foundation of my whole life. I did not move. I did not breathe. I let the darkness swallow my shock and turn it, slowly, into something cold and hard and permanent. I heard the bell chime as they walked out into the daylight. And Enzo unlocked my door, sweating, looking at me with pure terror and pity. I didn't say a word. I just reached out, gripped his shoulder in silent gratitude, and walked straight out the front door. To any parent listening, I need you to hear this. Predators do not come with warning labels. They come disguised as everything your child has ever wanted. They use charm as a weapon and isolation as a tool. And if you ever feel that wrongness in your gut, the thing you can't quite explain, do not politely step aside. It is always better to be the villain in your child's eyes for 1 month than to mourn them for the rest of your life. I climbed into my truck and gripped the wheel until my knuckles went white. I did not call the police. I had no recording, no proof, nothing but my word against theirs, and I knew Elise was completely under his spell. So I drove straight to her building, the rage in my chest a living thing. I was going to kick her door off its hinges and tear the truth out of him. I shoved past the concierge, rode the elevator to the penthouse, and slammed the door open so hard it cracked against the wall. Elise gasped and dropped a stack of invitations, and Julian was sitting on the sofa, sipping sparkling water, and he did not flinch. He did not jump. He just looked at me with cold, empty, analytical eyes, the eyes of a predator studying its prey. I crossed the room in 3 strides and pointed at his face and told him I knew exactly what he was planning. I demanded to know about the medical power of attorney, the $12 million policy, the sudden trek in the Andes. I turned to Elise and begged her to get away from him, told her he and his so-called sister were planning to kill her, and Julian did the most terrifying thing imaginable. He sighed. He set down his glass. He looked at Elise with an expression of deep, wounded sympathy. He stood slowly, hands open in surrender, and in a voice so smooth it made me sick, he said he understood why I was confused. He walked to his briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and laid them across the kitchen island, smoothing the pages with manicured hands. And he explained, patiently, that the trust was standard procedure for wealthy families entering a marriage, that my real estate holdings meant Elise faced a crushing estate tax. He threw around percentages and legal terms with the precision of a corporate attorney. He said the medical power of attorney was just a routine rider the lawyers attached, to protect Elise if anything happened to me, not the other way around. He twisted it so flawlessly that for 1 sickening second, even I questioned my own sanity. Then I brought up the $12 million. I called it a motive for murder. And he didn't raise his voice. He pulled a bank letter from the briefcase and explained, gazing at Elise with total devotion, that the life insurance was a requirement from the private bank to secure the mortgage on the home he was buying for their future. A safety net, he called it, so she'd never be buried in debt if he died. He made it sound romantic. He made it sound like the ultimate act of a providing husband. As for the Andes, he smiled softly and reminded Elise it was supposed to be a surprise, a guided luxury trek with professional porters, not some dangerous solo climb. He played the victim with chilling perfection. He looked at me with sorrowful eyes and quietly asked why I hated him so much that I'd invent a murder plot days before the happiest moment of her life. And I turned to my daughter, desperate for her to see through him. I begged her to listen, tried to tell her about Enzo in the fitting room and the conversation I'd just heard. But when I looked into Elise's eyes, I did not see the girl I'd raised. I saw a stranger, wrapped inside a carefully built illusion. Her face was flushed with anger, her hands trembling, and every bit of it was aimed at me. She stepped in front of Julian, shielding him, and told me I'd lost my mind. Her voice cracked as she brought up her mother. She said that ever since Rosemary died, I'd become paranoid and suffocating and controlling. She accused me of trying to ruin her happiness because I was terrified of being alone. Every word was a dagger placed exactly where it would hurt most. I tried to explain the coldness in Corinne's voice, the malice I'd heard through that wall, but Elise held up her hand and refused to hear another word. She said I'd spent my whole life building cold, lifeless steel, and now I was trying to tear down the one beautiful thing she'd built for herself. She sobbed that Julian had done nothing but love and support her, while I acted like a crazy old man trying to sabotage her future. And she pointed at the open door and screamed at me to leave and not come back until I was ready to apologize. And over her shaking shoulder, as Julian wrapped his arms around her and kissed her hair, he looked right at me, and a slow, chilling smirk crept across his face. The smirk of a man who knew he'd just won the first round. If you've ever tried to warn someone you love about a danger they refuse to see, you know that specific helplessness. It's not just fear for them. It's the agony of watching your own words get turned into proof that you're the problem. And in that moment, I understood something cold and clear. If I kept fighting him in the open, she would cut me off completely, and she would die on that mountain. So I turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind me, and I stood alone in that carpeted hallway, cut off from my only child, with no evidence and no allies left in her life. But I also knew the truth, and if Julian wanted to play a game in the shadows, he was about to learn exactly how ruthless a loving father could be. I spent a sleepless night, forcing my bruised pride to submit to cold logic. An engineer knows you don't attack a fortified wall head-on. You find the stress points, and to find them, you need access. So the next morning, I did the hardest thing I've ever done. I called my daughter, and I lied. I made my voice shake. I forced a trembling, pathetic tone, apologized for my outburst, blamed it on grief and a panic attack at the thought of giving her away, and begged her forgiveness. She hesitated, suspicious, but her heart is good. She softened and invited me to Sunday brunch at the club to clear the air. She said Julian had encouraged her to give me another chance. I thanked her, hung up, and felt an icy resolve settle into my bones. Sunday morning I walked onto that club patio in a tailored suit and a perfectly built mask of contrition. Elise, Julian, and Corinne were seated at a table over the water. Julian stood to greet me, radiating a smug, magnanimous victory, pulling out my chair, ordering me coffee, playing the gracious winner. Corinne sipped a mimosa, tracking my every move with calculating eyes, and I sat down, unfolded my napkin, and shut off the part of my brain that wanted to grab him by the throat. I turned on the engineer, and I began to look for the hairline fractures in their facade. Julian dominated the conversation, name-dropping elite boarding schools and yacht clubs, resting his left arm on the white tablecloth to display a gold vintage watch. He caught me looking and proudly said it was a family heirloom from his grandfather, a titan of industry. From a distance, it was a beautiful piece, but I have spent my whole life restoring these machines. And as he reached for his water, the light caught the dial, and I watched the second hand. In a genuine vintage mechanical watch, the second hand sweeps in one smooth, continuous glide. Julian's did not sweep. It ticked, one rigid jump per second, a quartz movement. It was a cheap, mass-produced fake, wrapped in shiny gold. A counterfeit, just like the man wearing it. A crack in the foundation had just shown itself. I filed it away and nodded along to his invented family history. A few minutes later, the plates came, and while adjusting my silverware, I deliberately knocked my napkin off my lap. I leaned down to pick it up and glanced under the table for half a second, and what I saw froze my blood. Corinne, the woman introduced as his older sister, had slipped off her heel, and her bare foot was resting high on Julian's inner thigh, her toes slowly stroking his leg. It was a deeply intimate gesture that no sister on earth would make. They were relaxed, confident, certain the foolish old man across the table was blind to their game. I sat back up, my face blank, my heart hammering, and I turned my attention to Elise. And that was the thing that nearly broke my composure entirely. My vibrant, energetic daughter had barely spoken 3 sentences. She sat slumped and defeated, her skin pale and ashen, an almost translucent quality to it. She stared at her untouched food with vacant, unfocused eyes. When the waiter asked about a refill, she blinked several times, struggling to process the simple question. And Julian smoothly intervened, laying a controlling hand over hers, answering for her, saying she was just tired from wedding planning. And Elise nodded, a slow, robotic movement, and leaned her heavy head on his shoulder. The realization hit me like a truck. She wasn't just tired, she was drugged, sedated into a compliant fog so she wouldn't notice the red flags, so she'd sign whatever they put in front of her. Every instinct screamed at me to flip the table and drag her out and scream for the police and a blood test. But the engineer clamped down hard, because if I called the police right then, with a fake watch and a glance under a table as my only evidence, Elise would defend him. The police would see a hysterical old man, and Julian would know the depth of my suspicion. He would accelerate. He would take her far away where I could never reach them. Acting on impulse would sign my daughter's death warrant. I needed hard, irrefutable proof, bank records, toxicology, a trail no lawyer or judge could ignore. So I finished that brunch playing my role to perfection, kissed Elise's pale cheek in the parking lot, waved goodbye with a gentle smile, and watched Julian guide her into his car like a captor leading a captive. And the second they were out of sight, my smile vanished. The next morning, I drove to my bank in a plain jacket and a ball cap, walked past the tellers to Private Wealth Management, and told my banker I needed $100,000 in untraceable cash for a confidential private venture. He looked concerned but didn't push. An hour later, I walked out with a heavy duffel bag over my shoulder. I wasn't looking for the kind of private detective who photographs cheating spouses. I needed a ghost. Someone who understood financial fraud and didn't care about red tape. I made careful calls to old contacts, men who dealt with corporate espionage, and everyone gave me the same name, Silas Crane. Silas was a former federal financial investigator, pushed out of the agency a decade ago for methods that were too ruthless. He cared about results, not rules. I walked into his sparse office and dropped the duffel on his metal desk and unzipped it. He barely blinked. He leaned back in his chair and asked who we were destroying today. I told him everything, and when I finished, he pulled out a clean notepad and said we were going to trace every breath this man had ever taken. But first, I needed a diversion. I needed Julian to feel completely safe. So I called Elise while loudly packing, playing the broken father who'd finally accepted defeat. I told her our fight had shaken me, that I was letting my grief ruin her big week, and that I was flying out to a fly fishing lodge in Montana to clear my head and come back ready to walk her down the aisle with a real smile. I could hear Julian in the background, urging her to put me on speaker, and he chimed in, dripping with fake concern, telling me Montana was a fantastic idea, and he'd take perfect care of Elise while I was gone. I swallowed the bile in my throat, told my daughter I loved her more than life, and hung up. Julian thought he'd banished the meddling old man 1,000 miles away. He was fatally wrong. I did not go to Montana. I drove to a private airfield outside the city where Silas had already chartered a small, untraceable jet through a shell account. We boarded in silence with 2 overnight bags and 2 laptops. And as the jet climbed and banked east, Silas laid out the wedding invitations Julian had so proudly designed, heavy cream cardstock with a family crest and an elegant return address. Julian had bragged endlessly about generational wealth, a historic stone estate in one of the most exclusive old money enclaves in the country, in Greenwich, Connecticut. He'd spun tales of manicured gardens and libraries and luxury cars, said his parents were touring Europe and would fly in for the rehearsal dinner. A perfect narrative, designed to make my daughter feel like she was marrying royalty. But as Silas typed, tapping into databases the government thought it had closed, the cracks multiplied. Property records, utility bills, zoning permits. The Greenwich address on the invitations did not belong to any Sterling family. There was no record of a wealthy Sterling family in that zip code for the last 50 years. We landed under a heavy gray sky, rented a plain sedan, and drove toward the address printed on those elegant invitations. My heart pounded. And as the GPS pulled us off the affluent boulevards of Greenwich and across an invisible line into the hard, industrial edge of neighboring Bridgeport, the grand mansions gave way to cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences. I rolled the car to a slow stop at the exact coordinates Julian had given the world, and I stared out the windshield in absolute disbelief. There was no stone mansion, no gardens. The address belonged to a dilapidated, abandoned row of storefronts, windows boarded with rotting plywood covered in peeling graffiti. The specific unit he'd listed as his family estate was a tiny, ruined shopfront that used to be a check-cashing place, its faded awning sagging toward a parking lot full of broken glass and weeds. Silas sat quietly, then slowly closed his laptop and looked at me. And the silence in that car was suffocating. Julian Sterling was not a wealthy investor from an old money family. The man sleeping next to my heavily drugged daughter did not actually exist. Silas opened the laptop again and went to work, linking the derelict address to a web of shell companies, tracing a routing number through a financial database, following the money, and the screen filled with a cascade of wire transfers and offshore accounts, an intricate machine washing stolen money through dummy corporations and funneling it into a single checking account here on the West Coast. That account was the lifeblood of his fabricated life. It paid for the car, the suits, the five-star dinners, the whole illusion of a successful investor. Every dime of it extracted from the accounts of other victims and laundered through a rotting storefront. And as I stared at those numbers, my mind drifted back to my own 40 years. I did not inherit a penny. I started as a junior engineer in steel-toed boots and a hard hat, walking job sites when the rebar was still exposed and the wind came off the sound cold enough to cut through you. I worked 80-hour weeks and missed dinners and recitals because I was determined to build an unbreakable foundation for my family. I remembered the permanent ache in my back, the calluses that never faded, the nights at the kitchen table agonizing over load calculations. I poured my sweat into the ground of this city so my daughter would never know instability. And now, I was staring at the exact opposite of everything I stood for. A parasite. A hollow man who built nothing, created nothing, who simply found trusting, hard-working people and drained them dry. And he was trying to hijack 40 years of my sacrifice overnight. I opened my eyes, and the sadness burned away, leaving nothing but resolve. I was not going to expose him. I was going to dismantle him. Then Silas let out a sharp breath and stopped typing. He leaned close to the screen, his professional detachment replaced by genuine shock. He muttered that this guy was sloppy for someone playing such a high-stakes game. I demanded to know what he'd found. He pulled up a digitized police record from a precinct in Nevada, over a decade old. By cross-referencing the origin accounts against old fraud warrants, he'd bypassed the fake identity. Julian Sterling was an alias created 4 years ago. His real name was Curtis Rourke. And Curtis Rourke was a convicted con artist who'd served 3 years in a state penitentiary for a real estate scam that specifically targeted elderly widows. The man sleeping next to my daughter was a convicted felon, but Silas wasn't done. His fingers flew again, and a scanned document appeared, an official state record with a raised seal and signatures. He downloaded it, opened it full screen, stared at it for a long moment, then closed his eyes, let out a heavy sigh, and slammed the laptop shut. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the small car. He looked me dead in the eyes and told me to brace myself. And he said the words that officially began the destruction of my daughter's carefully built fantasy. He said they were not brother and sister. I asked him to say it again. He didn't. He just opened the laptop and enlarged the document until the text filled the screen. It was a marriage certificate, filed in Clark County, Nevada, 8 years ago. The first signature belonged to Curtis Rourke, the felon I knew as Julian. The second belonged to Corinne Rourke, the woman staying in my daughter's guest room, eating our food, posing as his loving sister. They were not siblings. They were husband and wife. The depravity of it washed over me like a physical blow, and my mind flashed to that bare foot under the tablecloth while my drugged daughter sat across from them. Silas explained what we were looking at. A professional grifter team. They hunted wealthy, isolated, grieving women, desperate for love. He'd play the perfect suitor with fabricated wealth. She'd insert herself as the welcoming sister, completing the illusion of family and stability. And once the victim was cut off from her real family, they'd strike without mercy. But this time, Silas said, his eyes dark, the stakes were higher. Elise wasn't just a woman with a healthy savings account. She was the sole heir to everything I'd spent 40 years building, and she was about to be tied to a $12 million life insurance policy. They weren't just planning to rob her and run. They were planning to take my entire legacy and then kill my only child on a freezing mountain to cash out the ultimate prize. I sat back against the seat, struggling to breathe. I'd spent my life calculating load-bearing walls and reinforcing foundations against hurricanes and earthquakes. Nothing had prepared me for the structural collapse of my own family. The monsters were already inside the house, sleeping under my daughter's roof, poisoning her mind and body, and I could not afford the luxury of grief. Elise needed an engineer. She needed a father who could build a trap so airtight these parasites would never see the sun again. Silas asked how we should proceed, suggesting we take the marriage certificate to the local police and arrest Julian on his old warrants. I shook my head. An old fraud charge would put Curtis Rourke away for a few months. Corinne would post bail, and they'd vanish. Before I could secure Elise's safety, I needed them to face justice for attempted murder, exposed so completely there'd be no room for a plea. We were sticking to the original plan. We had to let them walk into the trap at the rehearsal dinner. And right then, my phone buzzed. A text from Elise. I opened it, and my blood froze all over again. She'd written that Julian said her vitamins were making her dizzy, so they were moving the Andes trip up by 2 days. They were leaving right after the reception. I read it 3 times. He was accelerating. He knew the drugs were taking a visible toll, that she was becoming too weak to stand through a long reception, or maybe he'd sensed my shift at the brunch. Whatever the reason, he was removing her from American soil, away from my protection and American law, faster than I'd planned. The rehearsal dinner was no longer just the final piece of the trap. It was the deadline. If I failed there, she'd be on a plane to South America by midnight, and I would never see my daughter alive again. I handed the phone to Silas. His jaw tightened. Our window had just slammed shut by 48 hours. I turned the key, the engine roared, and I told him we needed to be back in Seattle before sundown. I had less than 72 hours to save her life. The flight back was silent. I visualized the penthouse, calculating blind spots. And the moment we landed, Silas pulled up the tracking software he used to hunt fugitives and confirmed that Julian and Elise were across town at a bakery for a cake tasting, and Corinne was at a bridal boutique. The penthouse was empty. The window was narrow. I left Silas parked 2 blocks away and walked to the building with my head down. I bypassed the lobby entirely and used the underground service entrance, the one I remembered from the original construction blueprints, because 30 years ago my firm had consulted on that very high-rise. I rode the freight elevator up and stood before their oak door. Julian had bragged about his military-grade smart lock. To an engineer who spent decades designing commercial access systems, it was a puzzle. I knelt, found the maintenance gap, disrupted the current with a bypass probe just long enough to disengage the bolt, and the door sighed open. The apartment smelled of expensive candles and something rotten underneath. I moved straight to the room Julian used as an office, searching drawers and cabinets and false bottoms, finding nothing. He was a con artist. He'd never leave his secrets in a drawer. So I stepped back and looked at the room the way a builder looks at a room. I compared the interior dimensions to the hallway outside, and there was a discrepancy. The wall behind his desk was nearly 8 inches thicker than it should be. I ran my hands over the drywall and tapped, and about 3 feet up, the sound shifted from a hollow echo to a dull, dense thud. I found the seam, pressed the panel, and it popped open on a hidden hinge. Behind it sat a heavy, fireproof safe with a mechanical combination dial. Cracking a mechanical safe takes silence and an understanding of friction. I pressed my ear to the cold steel, closed my eyes, and turned the dial slowly, listening for the microscopic clicks of the tumblers falling. The first number caught, then the second, then the third. I pulled the handle down, and the door swung open. Inside was a small plastic tray. On it, a cheap burner phone. And next to the phone, An amber prescription bottle stripped of any pharmacy label, wrapped instead in a strip of white masking tape. The tape read, Elise's supplements. I unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers. Inside were heavy, unmarked blue capsules. These were not vitamins. These were the chemical chains binding my daughter to her executioner. I tipped out exactly 2, slipped them into my breast pocket for testing, screwed the cap back on, and set the bottle exactly where I found it. And then the private elevator chimed. They were back early. Panic flared. I shoved the tray into the safe, slammed the steel door, kicked the wall panel back into place, and lunged out of the office and down the hall into the emergency stairwell, pulling the fire door shut behind me, leaving it cracked less than an inch, a fraction of a second before Julian rounded the corner. I pressed my back to the wall. I heard him walk into his office. I heard the panel pop, the dial spin, and then the electronic tone of the burner phone powering on, and I heard him speak in a hushed, businesslike tone. He confirmed the cake tasting went fine and Elise was resting. And then he said the words that confirmed my worst nightmare in a flat, clinical voice. He said the dosage was perfect. Her heart rate was dropping. It would look exactly like natural altitude sickness in the mountains. The fire door felt like ice against my spine. I waited until his footsteps moved away, then slipped down the stairwell to the garage and out to the car. I dropped the 2 blue capsules on the console and told Silas exactly what I'd heard. He didn't show a flicker of surprise. He put the car in drive and said we were going to a private lab he trusted. He took me to a forensic toxicologist named Dr. Miles Hartley, a quiet man with tired eyes who owed Silas a favor and didn't ask where unmarked pills came from. He took the capsules, placed them in a tray, and told us the analysis would take 3 hours. Those were the longest 3 hours of my life. I paced a small windowless room, thinking about Elise's pale skin and empty eyes. And finally the door opened, and Dr. Hartley walked in with a grim expression, the look a doctor gives before a terminal diagnosis. He told me the capsules were not supplements. They were a lethal combination of 2 prescription drugs. One was a powerful medication that forces the heart rate and blood pressure down and holds them there. The other was a heavy, fast-acting sedative. He explained the deadly logic of it, and I'll spare you the clinical detail, but the short version chilled me to the core. At sea level, those pills would just make a person exhausted and foggy, mimicking a bad virus. But taken while climbing to extreme altitude, where the body desperately needs the heart to speed up to survive on thin air, the medication would prevent the heart from responding, and the conflict would stop it. It would look exactly like a tragic natural death from altitude sickness on a mountain, a flawless, untraceable execution. The room spun, and the cold control I'd held all week shattered. This was premeditated murder. They were managing my daughter's chemical decline, preparing her body for a lonely death, all to collect $12 million and inherit my life's work. I let out a sound I didn't recognize, grabbed the edge of a metal table, and hurled it across the room. I turned for the door. I didn't care about plans or evidence anymore. I was going to drive to that penthouse and tear Julian apart with my bare hands. And Silas moved faster than a man his size should. He slammed against the door, blocking me, and when I grabbed his shirt to throw him aside, he pinned me to the wall with terrifying strength. He got in my face and barked at me to stop acting like a fool. He told me that if I killed Julian today, I'd rot in prison. Corinne would vanish with the hidden money, and Elise would be left alone and traumatized and exposed to whatever was left of their network. His grip tightened, and his voice dropped to a razor's edge. He said we had to destroy them legally, systematically, and publicly. We had to trap them in a cage built of their own arrogance, expose them in front of everyone they'd fooled. Only then would Elise truly be safe. I let go of his shirt. The red rage receded into a dark, calculated hatred. I nodded, and Silas told me that while the toxicologist worked, he'd run a deeper background check, hunting unresolved deaths and insurance payouts linked to Rourke's aliases over the past decade. He turned the laptop toward me, and there was a scanned newspaper clipping from 2 years ago, from a coastal California town. The headline announced the sudden death of a wealthy widow during a private diving trip off Catalina Island. Her husband survived, and the grainy photo of the grieving widower on the dock, younger, his hair styled differently, but with that same cold predatory set to his shoulders, was unmistakably Julian. It was Curtis Rourke, perfecting his craft, 2 years before he ever laid eyes on my daughter. Silas read the details in a flat, clinical voice. The victim was a 32-year-old woman who'd recently inherited a fortune, married less than a month. She supposedly got into difficulty during a night dive in rough water and drowned before the Coast Guard could reach her. The autopsy found heavy traces of sleep aids, but the husband explained she'd been suffering from anxiety and insomnia before the wedding. It was ruled a tragic accident. He walked away cleared of any wrongdoing, and $6 million was wired into his accounts. And the blinding rage that had nearly consumed me went cold and clear. I was no longer dealing with a greedy con artist looking for a quick payday. I was dealing with an experienced, methodical serial killer. He'd done this before, gotten away with it perfectly, and he was refining his process so he'd never be caught. Elise was simply his next target, a bigger payout requiring a more sophisticated execution. But a killer, no matter how smooth, is fundamentally arrogant. Julian believed he was the smartest man in any room. He looked at me and saw a grieving, obsolete old man he could sweep aside. He had no idea he'd declared war on a master builder. An engineer doesn't panic when he finds a fatal flaw in a structure. He calculates the loads and builds a permanent solution to neutralize the threat. And I was going to build a trap so airtight that Julian would never see the sun again. I called my personal estate attorney, Douglas Wexler, a razor-sharp legal mind who'd handled my affairs for 25 years, and told him it was life and death, and to meet me at his office immediately. I walked in at sunrise and dropped the folder of evidence on his desk. But before he could open it, I pulled out the medical power of attorney. Julian had shoved at me, and I told Douglas to read every line. He put on his glasses and scanned it, his expression neutral, until he reached the third page, and then the color drained from his face. He lowered the document with a trembling hand, looked up at me with genuine horror, and told me this was not a standard medical proxy. It was an ironclad death warrant wrapped in deceptive legal language. He said if Elise signed it, Julian would have absolute, uncontested medical authority over her life. If she went into a coma on that mountain, he would have the sole legal right to end her care immediately, and the document specifically stripped me of any right to intervene. He could legally kill her while the doctors stood back and watched. The silence in that office was absolute, and a strange calm washed over me. A lesser man would have torn the document to pieces. A terrified father would have called the police to stop the wedding by force. But I'm an engineer. When you find a vulnerability in an enemy stronghold, you don't board up the tunnel. You wire it and wait for them to walk inside. I looked Douglas in the eye and told him we were not going to block the power of attorney. He recoiled, and I explained that Julian was a meticulous predator who anticipated resistance. If I blocked his trap, he'd know his cover was blown, drain his accounts, and vanish. I needed him to feel the rush of total victory, so I instructed Douglas to draft a second, invisible legal maneuver, a poison pill clause buried deep in a separate trust document that Julian would also have to sign at the dinner. A clause that would nullify the medical power of attorney the instant his pen left the paper, and simultaneously trigger a complete freeze on every account tied to his name. Undetectable to anyone but a seasoned trust attorney. Douglas's fear turned to a grim, determined smile, and he promised it would be flawless. Then I drove to the federal building and called Wesley Kane, the local FBI field director. 20 years ago, Wesley was a young agent whose career was nearly destroyed by a corrupt technicality, and I'd used my influence and my resources to quietly fund the legal defense that saved him. He owed me a life debt, and I was calling it in. Within 20 minutes, I was in his soundproof office, laying the nightmare across his desk. The toxicology report, the fabricated Greenwich estate, Curtis Rourke's real identity, the California drowning. Wesley connected the dots, leaned back, and ran a hand over his face. He told me it was a textbook predatory long con, exploiting the gaps between state and international law, and he explained the hard reality. Prosecuting a man for a murder that hadn't happened yet was incredibly difficult. The California case was closed. The stolen pills could be explained away as a pharmaceutical mix-up. To lock Julian away for life, the FBI needed to catch him committing an undeniable felony in real time. And Wesley explained that if Julian knowingly signed the fraudulent trust documents under his fake identity, intending to extort millions from a federally insured bank, that was wire fraud and identity theft, with massive mandatory sentences, and the Bureau could raid the event. The rehearsal dinner would become ground zero. Agents would infiltrate as staff and technicians. The room would be wired, but the whole operation hinged on one fragile point. Julian had to physically pick up the pen and sign his fake name. He had to feel completely safe, utterly victorious, in the exact moment he committed the fraud. If he sensed a single flaw in the room, he'd refuse, and the entire trap would collapse. The weight of that settled on me like lead. The rehearsal dinner was in less than 4 hours. I drove home, splashed cold water on my exhausted face, and stared at my reflection. I had to walk into a crowded room and break bread with the monster planning to murder my child. I had to clink glasses and give a warm speech and look into a serial killer's eyes without a single flicker of the rage boiling inside me. If my smile faltered, if my hands shook, he would spook and run. I adjusted my tie, buried the terrified father deep, and resurrected the engineer. Now here is where time slowed all the way down, because I have relived this next hour more than any other in my life. The rehearsal dinner was in the grand ballroom of a waterfront hotel, a spectacular display of manufactured wealth funded entirely by my own accounts. 150 of the city's most influential people were gathered, developers and politicians and socialites, sipping champagne, completely unaware they were extras in a staged theater of deception. I paused at the arched entrance, let my shoulders slump, let my face fall into a mask of exhaustion, and became a tired old man who'd finally surrendered. Julian materialized from the crowd in a flawless tuxedo, a wide, magnanimous smile on his handsome face, the radiant, terrifying smile of a predator who believed he'd already eaten his prey. He gripped my hand in a dominant handshake and thanked me loudly for coming, playing the gracious son-in-law for the room. He leaned close and whispered that he was glad I'd decided to be reasonable. I lowered my eyes in submission and told him quietly that I only wanted my daughter to be happy. Corinne glided over in a crimson gown, offering me a champagne flute with rehearsed warmth, telling me how thrilled she was to merge our families. I took the glass, brought it to my lips, and let not a single drop pass. And then I looked toward the head table, and my heart shattered. Elise sat in a high-backed velvet chair, isolated amid the celebration, a fragile ghost of herself. Her bright eyes were sunken and dull, ringed with bruised shadows. Her skin was translucent. She was trembling, gripping the edge of the table just to stay upright. She was lost in a chemical fog so thick she couldn't see the danger around her. I wanted to run to her and carry her out of the building, but I caught the subtle movements. A catering captain adjusting an earpiece, a lighting technician shifting a hidden camera. Wesley and his agents were in position, invisible. The trap was armed. I had to hold my ground. I took my seat beside my daughter. She turned her head slowly and gave me a faint, trembling smile, whispering she was glad I was there. I squeezed her cold hand and silently promised her the nightmare was almost over. The dinner began, course after course tasting like ash. Julian held court, charming the table with tales of generational wealth, occasionally leaning over to kiss Elise's pale cheek, every gesture a calculated brick in his alibi. And I sat quietly, eating nothing, playing the broken father with iron discipline, waiting with the cold patience of a man who has spent his life waiting for concrete to cure. As the dessert plates were cleared by undercover agents, the room began to settle, and Julian rose, a fresh glass of champagne held high, and tapped a spoon against the crystal. 150 people fell silent. He smiled and swept his gaze across the crowd until it rested on me, and he announced, in a booming, theatrical voice, that before the dancing, my wonderful father-in-law had a special gift to present to the new couple. The formal signing of the family trust. He reached into his jacket and produced a leather portfolio and girl. And what the lethal medical power of attorney and a heavy gold pen. The gold pen felt cold against the calluses of my fingers. I picked it up slowly, turning it over as if weighing the metal. The entire room held its breath. 150 pairs of eyes fixed on the defeated old man about to sign away his empire and disappear. And I looked at my daughter, slumping sideways in her chair, her eyelids fluttering as she lost the battle against the poison in her blood, entirely oblivious that the paper in front of me was a death warrant. And I tore my eyes from her pale face and looked directly at Julian. He was leaning forward over the tablecloth, practically salivating, his dark eyes tracking the pen with intoxicating greed. Corinne mirrored his anticipation, her fingers tight on her champagne stem. They were waiting for the final stroke of ink that would cement their victory. I let the silence stretch. I did not rush. I let the pressure build until it was almost tactile, and then I slid my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the marble, and I stood to my full height, straightening my shoulders, shedding the illusion of the broken old man. I reached across the table and pulled the microphone from the floral centerpiece closer to my mouth, because I knew Wesley and his team were listening for their trigger. I tapped it twice. The sound echoed like a gavel across the room. The elite guests shifted, sensing a change in the air, and I looked at Julian, locking onto his eyes with the cold precision of an engineer analyzing a critical failure, and I spoke. 40 years ago, I built my first bridge. I paused, letting the weight of it settle. I told the room that the fundamental rule of engineering is simple. You can use the finest materials in the world, hire the most brilliant designers, and polish the steel until it shines like a diamond. But if the foundation is poured on unstable ground, the entire structure is doomed. I kept my eyes fixed on Julian. A thing built on a lie will always collapse under the weight of its own deception, and a subtle shift occurred in his face. His smug smile faltered, replaced by a tightening of the jaw. He recognized the threat buried in my words. A man who'd spent his whole life building illusions to trap vulnerable women understood exactly what I meant. He glanced toward the exit, his survival instincts finally waking up, and I refused to break eye contact, letting the volcanic rage I'd suppressed for days bleed into my voice. I told the captivated room that a family is like a great structure, requiring honesty and transparency, and a foundation of genuine love to survive the storms. And when parasites infiltrate it, when they chip away at the load-bearing walls and replace solid steel with toxic manipulation, the whole building becomes a hazard to everyone inside. I raised the gold pen and declared that the document on that table was not a trust designed to protect my daughter. It was a snare, engineered by a man who had perfected the art of predatory destruction long before he ever set foot in this state. A low murmur of confusion swept the ballroom, and Corinne lost her composure. She shot to her feet, her crimson gown rustling, her face a mask of indignation, and loudly suggested the stress of the wedding had caused me a mental breakdown. She lunged across the table to snatch the portfolio, and I slammed my left hand down on it, pinning it flat with a force that rattled the crystal and silenced her. I looked at her, stripping away the last of my polite facade, and told her to sit down and be quiet before she deeply regretted it. She froze, her eyes widening at the menace in my posture. I turned back to Julian. His face was drained of all color. He was slowly pushing his chair back, preparing to bolt. He knew the game was over, and I held the pen over the signature line, and I looked at the man who'd planned to murder my only child on a mountain for a payout, and I smiled, letting the wolf finally show its teeth. And I simply dropped the pen. It clattered against the wood and rolled away from the document. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, said nothing, stared into his panicked eyes, and tapped one button. Every light in the ballroom went black. For a fraction of a second, the only sound was the collective gasp of 150 people. I stood perfectly still in the dark, and beside me, I heard Julian let out a dismissive scoff, muttering about a blown fuse, still certain he controlled the narrative, with no idea I'd just detonated the charges beneath his foundation. Then a low hum began from the ceiling, the massive projector powering on. A blinding beam of white light sliced through the darkness and struck the huge screen behind the head table. The crowd murmured, expecting a romantic slideshow of the happy couple. Instead, the first image was a legal document, magnified so large the black text was legible from the back row. It took 3 seconds for the realization to land. It was the marriage certificate from Clark County, Nevada. The names Curtis Rourke and Corinne Rourke above their signatures, with the government seal and the date from 8 years ago. A sharp, unified gasp rolled through the room like a shockwave. The illusion of the loving sister shattered, broadcast in 10-foot letters for the whole city to see. I looked at Corinne. The projected light painted her face chalk white, her mouth hanging open, a trapped animal in a spotlight. And Julian jumped up, sending his chair crashing, waving his arm, shouting for someone to cut the power, screaming it was a prank, a forgery. But his smooth voice was now laced with shrill panic. The mask was cracking. I pressed the button again. The certificate vanished, replaced by a split screen. On the left, the California newspaper clipping about the diving death. On the right, the medical examiner's report highlighting the sleep aids in the victim's blood, and an arrow pointing from the name Curtis Rourke to a clear photograph of Julian standing on that Catalina dock 2 years ago. The murmurs became frantic whispers. The guests weren't confused anymore. They were terrified. They were realizing they'd just shared a meal with a predator. And I watched the developers physically lean away from the head table. I pressed the button a third and final time. The image shifted to the certified toxicology report, the clinical breakdown of the lethal cocktail, positioned right next to a crisp photograph of the blue capsules inside the amber bottle labeled Elise's supplements. The text explained how the combination was engineered to cause a fatal cardiac event at high altitude, mimicking a natural death on a mountain. And the ballroom erupted into chaos. Chairs shoved aside, shouts of horror, men yelling for someone to call the police. But the most important reaction came from the chair beside me. The screaming and the blinding light and the chaotic energy finally pierced the chemical fog around my daughter's mind. A massive spike of adrenaline cut through the sedatives. Elise's head snapped up. Her breathing went rapid and shallow. She braced her hands on the table, knuckles white, and forced herself upright. She turned her sunken eyes to the screen and read the toxicologist's report. And the devastating truth crashed down on her, shattering the beautiful illusion of her perfect romance. And she turned and looked directly at the man she'd planned to marry. And Julian looked back at her, and he realized he had walked blind into a slaughterhouse, and there was nowhere left to hide. Corinne bolted first, kicking her chair back and running for the swinging kitchen doors, seeing a dark service corridor to the parking garage. But she'd underestimated the perimeter I'd built. As her hands hit the doors, a massive shadow stepped into her path. Silas. He didn't say a word. He grabbed the fabric of her gown at the shoulder, spun her around, and slammed her back against the wall, pinning her there, neutralizing her escape before she cleared the room. And I did not spare Corinne a single glance. My eyes stayed locked on Julian, and the realization of his total defeat triggered a horrifying transformation. His charming facade melted away, revealing the cold-blooded killer underneath. His jaw clenched so hard I could hear his teeth grind over the screams. The federal agents disguised as staff were closing the perimeter, hands near their concealed weapons. He knew he was surrounded, but his pathological arrogance would not let him surrender. A feral scream ripped from his throat, and he planted his hands on the tablecloth and vaulted directly over the head table, sending silver and crystal and flowers crashing to the floor, and lunged at me, fingers curled into murderous fists, fully expecting me to cower like the broken old man I'd pretended to be all night. I did not flinch. I did not step back. All evening I'd leaned on a heavy oak cane to sell the illusion of my frailty, and Julian had dismissed it as a pathetic prop of old age. He was fatally wrong. It was a perfectly weighted, incredibly dense piece of hardwood. As he closed the distance, his face contorted with rage. I shifted my weight and planted my feet with the grounded balance of a master builder. I gripped the brass handle with both hands, pivoted my hips, and swung the shaft with every ounce of strength I had. I did not aim for his head. I calculated the exact trajectory to neutralize his momentum, and the oak struck him squarely across the side of his knee. The crack of bone echoed above the crowd. His forward motion collapsed, the joint shattering under the force, and his scream of rage became a howl of agony as his leg buckled and he crashed onto the cold marble, clutching his ruined knee as the agent surged forward. And even writhing on the floor surrounded by federal officers, his arrogance refused to die. He looked up at me, panting through clenched teeth, and sneered, trying to reclaim some scrap of control. He screamed that I had nothing on him, that I was just a paranoid old man who'd assaulted him in front of 100 witnesses. He pointed a trembling finger at the untouched portfolio on the table and shouted that he hadn't signed anything, and without his signature, I could never prove intent to commit fraud. He truly believed he'd found the one microscopic flaw in my trap. And I slowly lowered the cane, stepped to the edge of the table, leaned down to the microphone, and looked into his pathetic eyes, and I said, quietly, with absolute certainty, "Oh, but you did." His face twisted in confusion and pain. He wheezed that his signature was on nothing. And I stepped around the wreckage and delivered the final blow to his crumbling foundation. I told him he was right about the trust document on the table. He hadn't signed it. But his narrow mind had been focused on the wrong trap the entire time. I told him that wire fraud was never the charge I truly cared about. That was just the mechanism to guarantee federal jurisdiction. And I leaned close to the microphone so every guest and every agent and my terrified daughter could hear, and I asked him a simple question. I asked if he honestly believed he'd been poisoning Elise's vitamins for the last 3 days. The color drained from what was left of his face. His eyes shot to Elise, sitting upright now, listening with dawning, horrified clarity, and I didn't give him a second to respond. I raised my voice and revealed that I had broken into their impenetrable penthouse 3 days ago while they were distracted by their wedding, bypassed his expensive lock, found the hidden safe behind the false wall, and cracked it. I watched the terror finally eclipse the pain in his eyes, as he understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. I told him I'd found the bottle labeled with my daughter's name, taken the capsules to an independent toxicologist, and confirmed exactly what they were. And then I executed the most important part of my counterattack. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I had swapped every single one of his poison pills with completely harmless placebos. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The murder plot was now undeniable, and I kept going. I told him the real poison he'd acquired to kill my daughter was no longer in his possession. I had personally handed the lethal drugs and the burner phone he'd used to coordinate it directly to the FBI, and that federal technicians had already pulled his fingerprints, his messages, and his location data from that phone. He had, without knowing it, handed the government a flawlessly documented confession. Elise let out a sharp, trembling breath. The fog was lifting, replaced by the sheer gravity of how close she had come. She stared at the man who'd whispered promises of forever while feeding her a slow death, and Julian tried to drag himself backward across the marble, hauling his shattered knee behind him, a rat in a steel snare. And then the heavy doors at the back of the ballroom burst open, and a dozen agents in tactical gear stormed in, led by Wesley Kane, who marched down the center aisle and pointed at the bleeding man on the floor and ordered his team to secure him. 2 agents hauled Julian to his feet, and he screamed as his knee took his weight, and they cuffed him and marched him out, thrashing and hurling incoherent threats as his entire fraudulent life came apart. And Silas walked Corinne back into the ballroom, her gown torn, her hair wild, screaming for a lawyer, and they cuffed her too and dragged her out, alongside her fake brother, into the flashing lights of the waiting cruisers. And I turned away from the departing monsters and looked at my daughter. Elise was shaking violently, her pale hands clutching the tablecloth, the horror of how close she'd come finally crashing down, and she let out a ragged, heartbreaking sob and collapsed into my arms, and I held her. I held my terrified, profoundly relieved only child as tightly as I could. The chaos slowly drained from the room, the elite guests scattering into the night, leaving overturned chairs and shattered glass across the marble, and Elise leaned her head against my chest, her breathing finally slowing as the last of the sedatives left her system. She looked up at me, her eyes searching my face with a heartbreaking mix of gratitude and guilt, and she apologized over and over, weeping for the lie she'd so desperately wanted to believe. She said she was sorry for pushing me away, for calling me a paranoid old man, for not seeing it, and I stroked her hair and told her she had nothing to apologize for. I told her that predators like Julian don't choose their victims because those victims are foolish. They choose them because they have kind, trusting, empathetic hearts. They weaponize your best qualities and use your own goodness as a blindfold. I tilted her chin up and told her that my only job in this world, from the moment I first held her, was to be her shield, and that a father does not stop protecting his child just because she believes she's safe. I told her I would gladly tear down every bridge I ever built and burn every dollar to ash to make sure she drew her next breath. A full year has passed since that night, and the quiet has finally returned to our lives. Faced with a mountain of evidence, the toxicology reports, the recovered burner phone, the connection to the California death, Julian and Corinne abandoned their arrogance and took a plea deal to avoid the ultimate penalty. They will spend the rest of their lives in a maximum security federal penitentiary. They filed a desperate appeal 6 months later, claiming I'd framed them and fabricated the evidence, and the judge laughed them out of the courtroom. Elise moved back home for a few quiet, healing months, and I watched the fog clear from her mind and the color return to her cheeks. Today, her floral studio is thriving, brighter and more successful than ever, and we spend our Sunday mornings on the porch with warm coffee, talking about everything and nothing. I didn't just save my daughter's life that night. I got my best friend back from the edge of an abyss. And there's one more detail I have to mention. Enzo Ferraro, the tailor who shoved me into that dark room and made me listen, has never had to pay for a meal or a drink in this city again. I made absolutely sure of that. So here's what I'd leave you with. And it's the reason I finally told this story. Sometimes the universe hands you a life-saving miracle wrapped inside an unbearable nightmare, and when it does, you must not panic. You have to stay quiet, listen carefully to the whispers of the enemy, and build your counterattack with cold, patient hands. And to any parent listening, never let the fear of pushing your child away stop you from trusting your gut. Predators do not wear warning labels. They come disguised as everything your child has ever wanted, using charm as a weapon and isolation as a tool. Here's the one thing I'd ask you to actually do this week. If someone new has entered your family's life, and the dynamics have quietly turned dark, if your once vibrant child has changed, do not just politely mind your own business. Ask the hard question no one else is brave enough to ask. And here's the question I want you to sit with tonight. Is there a gut feeling about someone you love that you've been talking yourself out of, and what would it cost you to finally listen to it? I really want to hear from you on this one. Comment a 1 if you think I did the right thing, moving in the shadows and springing the trap instead of going to the police that first day. Comment a 2 if you'd have gone straight to the authorities, evidence or not. Comment a 3 if you honestly don't know what you'd have done, because until it's your own child in the crosshairs, none of us truly knows. And tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are, because it amazes me where these stories travel. And if you've ever had a gut feeling about someone that turned out to be right, tell me your story below. Somebody scrolling past needs to hear it. If this proved to you that a father's love is the ultimate shield, the kindest thing you can do is subscribe and stay a while, because I have more of these, and this little corner only keeps going because folks like you decide to stick around. Thank you, truly, for spending this time with me. Stay safe out there, and trust your gut. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Seattle, Washington to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental,